So these are wrapped together in the sense that we have a single file that contains both the user interface and also does our database operation, right? We're connecting to the database, running queries. So the idea of Model View Controller is this kind of logic is broken up into a separate file, completely separate, that sits in between the models and the user interface. So there's all kinds of different MVC frameworks out there. It's fairly new to .NET. Moving forward into the future, Microsoft is sort of deprecating the web forms model that we've been using, and they're moving strictly to ASP.NET MVC. The reason we used web forms in this class is up until now there's been ASP.NET MVC is fairly new. It's only been around for a few years. So if you're going to go out and work with an existing .NET application, chances are it's going to be a web forms application like what we're using in here. So probably the most popular MVC framework out there is Ruby on Rails, which most of you have heard of. Really, MVC you could do in any language. Node.js has MVC, there's PHP, MVC frameworks. So once you understand the concept, which is basically that your application structure like this, you can pretty much work in any language. So why am I rattling on about this? Well, because Web API through Microsoft basically follows this same similar pattern. So we're going to add our models through Entity Framework. We're not going to have any views at all because there is no user interface component. But what we're going to do is use a controller for writing our actual CRUD methods and returning or receiving our JSON. That'll happen through the controllers.
What's the dispatcher for?
The dispatcher is kind of built into the framework. That isn't something we'll build. That's just basically plumbing that we don't really see. Okay.
Like the
Yeah, so it will do things like routing. So how do we interpret a URL request and route it to the appropriate method or action in the controller is basically kind of what the dispatcher does. It's sort of like URL mapping. We actually will need to do a little bit of this in our API. We'll need to configure it to tell it how to interpret those URLs because there's no actual pages. Right? A client will just send a request to a URL and get a bunch of data back, get a response back. So what we want to do, the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to build this out as a new solution. Okay, we're not going to wrap this into our existing solution. So if in Visual Studio we want to go ahead and make a new project. And I'll walk you through what we're going to build. So there are a bunch of really good tutorials here, and also if you want to learn MVC through here, there's actually a set of tutorials that have you build out this Getting Started with .NET MVC. It's an 11 tutorial series. This is basically building out the Contoso application using MVC. So they walk you through the whole thing. So you could do this on your own time. So it's building out that whole thing. So I'm going to make a new application, so new project. And this time what I'm actually going to choose, so I want to choose just my web application template. And I'm going to call this COMP2007 Web API Monday. And I'll also save this inside of my Lesson 12 subfolder, so my folder for today I'm going to have two separate solutions. Now this time, we're going to choose empty still, but I'm going to choose the option, before we've been choosing web forms, let's actually choose actually, hang on, I'll think for a minute whether I want Web API or MVC. Yeah, pick MVC.
Why is it not Web API?
Because it will auto-build a lot more stuff for us that way. We'll kind of do it ourselves if we pick MVC. And you'll see when this gets created, we'll have a look at what gets built here. Okay. So notice we get an app start folder.
Sorry, did you choose MVC or SVN?
I chose MVC. We're going to add another file in here with some global startup code. And it builds out controllers, models, and views. So these are blank. We're not going to build any views because there's not going to be any front end to this application. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add our Contoso model the same way we've done previously. So I'm just going to right click on my models folder. We want to add an ADO.NET, actually you can just go to add new item if you don't see it in that list. And under data, we'll want an ADO.NET entity data model. And just like before, I'm going to call this Contoso. So pick ADO.NET entity data model from the data tab. So this part is what we've already done. So we're going to choose from database. You will probably need to specify that it's a new connection. And I'm just going to go and grab the server name. I've kept my other solution open, so I'm just going to grab my Azure server name here. I'm going to connect. So my API is going to use the same database as the in-class application we've been building. Put in your credentials to your database. So typically we build the APIs as a separate application. If we're building a web app and then we're also going to build an API, we usually build those as separate applications. And I'm going to say, yep, store this in web.config, and I'll call it default connection. You know what, I'll call it default connection EF, just so it's consistent with our in-class application. We're not using ASP.NET Identity, so it doesn't really matter what you call the connection string. I'll pick Entity Framework 6. And I'm going to add the last 4 tables, just courses, departments, enrollments, and students. We probably don't need all of these tables, but I'm just going to add all 4 of them. So just the 4 tables that originally came as part of that Contoso script I gave you.
Do you need any authentication or like your username because it's being accessed from something that's already authenticated?
For now, we're just going to make it public. So typically what would happen, what usually happens is, just like in this example, which we could do after, usually we just give any client an API key. We generate like an encrypted string, we store that in the database, we give that to a client when and then they just have to provide that as a parameter with any method call they make. We'll just make a public API for now.
What did you call the block?
I just left it. I just left it as the default, doesn't really matter.
What did you leave, master entities or default connection?
I just called it default connection EF because that's consistent with the in-class application. So the entity framework will work and it'll build out the same model classes and context class that it gave us before. The only other thing I'm going to do, just like I did before, it bugs me that it chops off the E on course. So I'm just going to click on course and add it back, as well as here on the navigation property.
Did it go to the S of students?
Sorry?
Is it students or students?
No, the models are singular. So I'm just going to save and build. And now our model section is all ready to go. You know, we could use code first if we wanted to do this all in code, but we already have an existing database So let's just let any framework generate the models for us.
Did you just click everything or did you select?
Pardon me?
Did you just select everything or did you?
Bottom four.
I don't have bottom.
Department, courses, enrollments, and students. We're really only going to work with the courses table. That's the only one you need to add. I'm just adding the other ones in case I wanted to do other things with it. So those 4. So the next thing we want to do is we need to add some startup configuration for doing the routing, the URL routing, basically this part, kind of the dispatch from this model. So inside my Solution Explorer, inside of my app start, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a class which has a particular name. What do I want to call it? I'm going to call it Web API config.cs. So this will be a blank class. We're going to need to add one reference here. And we may need to use NuGet. Help if I could spell. So we want to add a reference to system.web.http, which doesn't show up. So if I add this in, Visual Studio tells me it doesn't know what that namespace is. So if I go back over to my Solution Explorer, we need to add a reference to that library. So I'm just going to right-click my references, choose Add Reference. And in here, I'm just going to search for system.web.http. And it should come up here. I'll just check that box.
What did you add? In the web, under, not that one. The web.
And click OK.
Where do you have the CS from?
You may have to search. If you don't find it, make sure you click on Framework over on the left. Click the Framework category and search for system.web.http.
Check it. Web API controller class? Is that what you had?
Nope. I created a class. So you should now have a reference to system.web.http. Then this error goes away. It now knows what this library is.
Oh, in startup class? That's what you had?
No, it's a class. Just a class.
What is that?
Where is that?
Add class
Under Visual C#.
under C#. Peter, watch. Don't look at your computer. Look at the overhead. Add. Class is probably right down at the bottom, and if it's not, choose New Item. Choose, and it should be the very first item here in Visual C#. Add a class. And it's called Web API Config. So we need a public method here that we're going to call register. And it takes a parameter of type HTTP configuration. This class is in this library, which is why we had to add the reference. So we want to configure the routing. How do we interpret this? How do we interpret URL requests? So what we want is to call the map HTTP root function, and we'll pass in a few parameters here. So we're going to set the name if courses is part of the URL.
Please get rid of that comment.
We're going to use a root template of API/courses, and then we'll put in an optional parameter. So if the user browses, whoops, sorry, there should be a slash here. The user sends a request to this URL, we're going to go to our courses controller, which we'll build, and invoke a method in there. So this controller will handle any requests at that URL. We also have to specify that the ID parameter is optional. The user might make a request just to API courses with no ID. If that's the case, we want to give them, we still want to invoke a method, but we're not looking up a particular record. So we also just want to specify, oops,
So those brackets mean it's optional.
sorry. Yes, those curly braces will indicate it's optional, but we're going to specify it here too. If we say defaults, so we're going to use a controller called courses, which we'll build, and our ID value is an optional root parameter. We may have an ID, and we may not. So this goes in app start. So this code will execute whenever the web server starts our API running.
Okay. What was the thing you were showing that I missed? You searched it and added it.
You need to right-click on your project and choose Add Reference. And then you need to click the framework link on the left and search for system.web.http.
Can't you just type the user in the top? That's what I've always done before.
I tried that, but without the reference, that will only work if the class you're referencing exists in an existing reference. System.web.http is not added by default to a web API project, so we have to add that in first in order for this to find that class.
Okay, so like when we did the Owen and the other stuff, it would have added the Owen stuff into references on the right, and that's why I made the references.
That's right. If you didn't use the stuff through NuGet, then those references over there wouldn't have worked.
System.web.
HTTP.
First one.
So we've said that URLs sent here will be interpreted by a courses controller. Well, we don't have that yet. So we have the model, we've got the routing, so we've done in this diagram, oops, we've done this part, Entity Framework did this. We've just set up, we'll have to do a little more configuration later, but we set up part of our dispatching and routing. So now we need the controller, we actually write the methods for getting a list of courses or getting a single course. So we're going to go to our controllers folder, we'll right click, and we'll choose add a new item. And if I expand web and choose web API, we may as well pick the latest version. We want a web API controller class. So it's under C# web API.
Isn't that kind of weird when they have both?
Yep. And it has to have a particular name. It has to be called courses, plural, and it needs the word controller as part of the name. That tells the server that this is a controller.
So you can't use the word controller in any other names?
No, do not. It's a keyword. So call it courses, plural controller. It's of type Web API controller class, and we'll see what visual. So notice it says right here, Kyle, Web API framework requires controller names to be suffixed with controller. So if you don't like that naming convention, too bad.
You're out of line. Is there any other values like that that you can't?
That's the big one. That's the important one. Okay. So I'm going to add that, and we'll see what Visual Studio gives us. So notice, you may have noticed, it added references to Web API. Sorry, it added packages. And notice what it did. It builds out 5 methods automatically. So a get method that returns a list in a string, a get method that accepts an ID parameter and returns a value, a post method, which is typically used for doing an insert, a put method, which is typically used for doing an update, right? We get an ID, as well as a request string with a bunch of values, and we have a delete with an ID. So we're not going to keep these, we're going to override these, but for now, so eventually what we're going to do is connect this up to our database. We're going to override the get method, but we can run it like this for now. And this should just return when we go to API/courses. By default, it should run the get method and return those values.
You put this in just app start?
No, this goes inside the controllers because it's a controller. So we've registered. I know there's one more thing we need to. We also need to do a little bit of configuration in our global ASAX. We could try to run this now. If I play it now, so I'm just going to start without debug. Actually, I'll start my debugger. So you can start yours.
Did we even put anything or just the CS?
So we'll get nothing on the home page because there is no home page. We'll probably get an error here.
Yeah.
404.
We'll get a 404 or a 40 or a cannot directory browse. Not sure why it's taking so long. Oh, it's never going to complete without that configuration. Oh, okay.
Mine did.
Sorry. So if I go to API/courses, we're getting a 404 because we've only done half of the dispatching, half of the routing. We need something else in our global ASAX that says when the application starts, we need the code in here to run. We need to map our HTTP routing. So let's go to our global ASAX.cs and open that up. First, we've got to reference the HTTP library. These 2 lines of code are here by default as soon as we created it as MVC. But we've got to add a couple things. Excuse me. Set our So we're going to refer to our web API config class, and we're going to call the register method we put in there.
What's the,
But we've got to pass in a parameter. So what we want is our global configuration. So this will pass the site configuration to our API config. I'm going to do one more thing. Actually, we can do it like this for now. We're going to make one more change. What this is going to do, when our API runs now, depending on which browser we run it in, we might get our data in this format. We might also get it in this format. Depends on the browser. IE is set up, well actually we'll run it in both, and rather than me tell you, I'll show you. We'll try it.
it's not letting me.
So build your solution. We'll start it again without, I'll do it without debugging.
It wouldn't let me reference app start.
Just a minute, Peter. So now if I make a request to API/courses, it actually by default runs our get method, and I'm in Firefox, so it returns this in XML.
In Chrome too.
Chrome will also by default return, serialize it to XML. Internet Explorer by default, it actually says, do you want to open or save courses.json? So Internet Explorer is actually ahead of the other two in that it by default will go to JSON. Now we can override that. This is probably the first thing you've ever seen that Internet Explorer does, more modern
Yeah.
than what Chrome and Firefox are doing.
Probably the last.
Now we can override that setting, okay?
Yeah, we don't want.
So let's remove XML as an output option in all browsers. So if we reference our global configuration, .configuration, it has a formatters property, has an XML formatter, so the supported media types we're going to call .clear, meaning remove XML as one of the supported formattings in our API. If we rebuild and try again in Firefox or Chrome, we should get JSON.
Is it dot encodings or dot media type?
Dot supported media types. There are several different ways to turn this off, to specify JSON only. This is probably the easiest. Just do it globally. So no XML.
Is it going to make it faster?
It should make it faster, yes. So now if I reload it in Firefox, now I get JSON. If I refresh it in Chrome, rather than getting all of this XML payload, well, let's look, right? Here's all the XML. Oh, oops. Ah, sorry, that was the old one. Wrong URL. That was my other solution. So in Chrome, we now get JSON, which is going to be faster. Now, it's just returning some static values. But notice, let's go and look at our controller method. So if we pass in no parameters, the controller's smart enough, the method's overloaded. Get is the default in any RESTful service. It will automatically run a get method. So with no parameters, it returns these values. What's going to happen if we route our request this way? API/courses, but we put on a slash and a number. What do you think what do we get returned instead? So it now runs, we have two get methods, right? So if there's no ID parameter, it runs this method. If there is an integer ID parameter, it runs this one and returns that. What'll happen if I pass in this? If I pass in a parameter, but if the parameter is a string, what will we get? Right? We're going to get that back. Because there's no method in our API, there's no get method that accepts a string. So let's write one. Let's write a get method that accepts a string, and then we're going to change these methods to actually use our database instead. So if we call get like this, we want to show all the courses. If we show get like this with an integer, we're going to look up and see if there's a course with that ID.
I still can't even get your references.
If we do it this way, we're going to pass in a course title and send the course information based on title. Right, so we're going to write three separate get methods. So let's create so let's create one more get method, string, we'll call it title. And we'll just return so now we've overloaded, we've got a second overload on get. We could pass in nothing, we could pass in an integer, or we could pass in a string. So if you build and now try going to API/courses/ put in a course title in the URL, what do you get back?
Course title is.
We'll try it and see. Pardon? So why did I get that error? I rebuilt
Because the ID is a string. Or it's looking for a string.
because it's set up this way with our root template, right? This is where the root template is important. So in this case, one parameter, it's always looking for ID here.
That needs ID string. Just to differentiate.
I'm going to think about that for a minute. We might have to change the name of that method. You know, I'm just going to comment that out for now. Come back to that.
What is your spec comment over?
This is comment, that's uncomment.
Oh, right,
Comment or uncomment the selected lines. So you just go uncomment, comment.
Where? Slash star.
Yeah, you don't need that.
Do you know what?
Use the toolbar. So what we want to do now, rather than just returning some hard-coded values, we actually want to connect to the database and send real data back out of the courses table. So we need to reference our database. So using our models. So rather than just sending back a string,
Return the database.
so we're going to change what we send back. Instead of sending back a string, we actually want to send back an object a collection of type course, right? We want to send back a collection of courses. So IEnumerable just means a list or a collection. So we're sending back a collection of this type.
What's the difference between enumerable and just a list? Because I read something that said I couldn't source query if it wasn't enumerable.
A list is, an IEnumerable is any collection. So a list is a type of IEnumerable. So I'm going to comment out this return line. So let's connect to the database first. So connect to the database with a using command. Run our query.
Did you go into Wave .config when I wasn't looking?
Nope. So we'll just run a query on our courses model. We'll order by, we can order by the course title. So nothing new here, we're just running a regular link query, same as we had in our application on our courses page. And we will just return our query results. We'll just convert it to a list. So rather than just hard coding these values, we're actually going to return data from our database in JSON format.
Can you do that online? Because I know you can do two
Yep.
lists after the
Yep. Oh, sorry, you mean,
Yeah.
so do the whole thing, so return, you mean do it all in one line of code like this?
Yeah. Declare it and return it the same one. Oh, no, I mean,
No.
after the from, you used to put first or default there. You can also do two lists there.
Well, it's not first or default, because first or default would only select one item. We're selecting the entire collection.
But where you put first or default, you can also put two lists. So you put the from and from.
Well, we don't typically need both. If we're selecting one record, we don't need to convert it to a list. We generally only use two lists when we're selecting multiple records. First or default only selects one record.
But you're converting it to a list in the next line down.
Yeah, but I'm not using first or default. First or default is for selecting a single record.
No, I'm saying where you normally type first or default, you can type to list and it's do the same.
Right, but I want it to be a return object, so I can't. I need to first fill the query and then return it. I see what you're saying. I can put it in brackets and do to list here, right? Yes, I could do it there. So let's build and call our get method again with no parameters. Okay. It's trying to write our JSON. We have one small problem. Okay. It says the object instance has been disposed and can no longer be used.
Is that the...
There's a workaround for this. It has to do with trying to connect the entity framework data to the JSON parser. You'll notice a strange reference in here. Newtonsoft.json. This is a third-party library that Microsoft uses for reading and writing JSON. When we try to pass in that entity framework object in here to serialize it as JSON, we get this error. There's a workaround for this. So all we're going to do is we'll make sure JSON parsing works with the EF object. So we just set a property on our database configuration. We need to turn off this property called proxy creation enabled. We just set that property to false. Our JSON serialization should be fine. So if I refresh and run it now, I should get all of my course data in JSON format. So I'll refresh. And there's our data. So if we wanted to expose this data to another application, and again, we can control what fields. Maybe we don't want to give them the IDs, for example. We would just modify our query so that our query excludes the course ID. If we wanted to only specify, for example, the title and credits, we would just change our link query, and that's what would get exposed to our any client application. Now this one's still hard-coded, right? So my IDs start with 4,000. We're still getting this, so let's quickly rewrite our second get method that if we have an ID parameter, we actually look up that record using first or default.
What about when we say?
So instead of returning a string, we want our get to return a course. We're changing the return type. We can comment out that original return statement. So we can connect. We're going to need to set that proxy enabled off for our JSON serialization. So we'll run our link query. So here we want the course ID to be equal to our parameter that our method takes. Whoops, sorry, this should be, I need a variable name. And then we'll just return that object. It's not a list, it's a course. And the JSON parser will just parse that object from a course into a JSON representation of that object. Well, it's not a list. This one returns a list because it's multiple records. This one is returning a course object, a single course only. So we don't want to use two lists. There is no list. So if we refresh that method. So I get that. If I pick another one. Now, if I put in a course ID that doesn't exist,
No.
we just get a null. Well, we've got two options, right? Either we can choose to return something else, Or we just have to specify in our API that this method will return either a course in JSON format, and we would provide a sample of that format in the documentation, much like they've done here.
Could we catch that in error handler? Or would it not throw an error?
Yes, we could also return an error code. So there's different ways we could handle it. Or we could just return null and let the client handle it however they want to. Also, if we wanted to let some other application do add, update, or delete, those would be the methods we would need. So again, it could pass in a string for post, for add, put for edit, and delete would get the ID. And then we could just take those, use Entity Framework to connect to the database. So there's nothing visual. Nobody would ever actually see these. Just one application could call our methods. It could send JSON in, get JSON out. Okay, so this is kind of at its simplest of what Web API might be able to do. Does anybody have any questions?
I have some things to fix.
If you wanted to do the string, would you just always take in a string and then convert it to an int, depending on what?
The challenge would be the signature in the URL. We probably would have to, rather than using it as a get, we'd probably have to give that action a different name. Because if we just had a get with one parameter,
Well, you can do it with one function just by.
yes, the way you're suggesting, or we'd have to do something like write the method like find by name, and then parameter, which is a different method from get.
So it maps.
Then in the controller, we could write a find by name, yeah, find by name method. Repeat the trick. Okay, how many of us are there? Let's see. 1, 3, 5, 9, 12, 15. 15. Okay. That's good. Today's lesson 12. Okay, so Justin and Hayden, you guys are going to work together. Robbie and Mallory, you can work together. Two of you can work together. Josh and Connor, Alex and John, you two guys, and you three. Okay, so let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
What are we working together on?
You're working together on your exam review / lab 5. So, here's what you're going to do. Let's just have a quick look at our syllabus for a minute. Actually, I guess we can do it right from Blackboard. Course documents. Okay, I'm going to give you each a lesson number, or in potentially 2. So you guys, lessons 1 and 2. Okay, you and Justin. Let's see. I think 3 and 4. 4 and 5. Sorry, 3 and 4. 5. 6. Josh and Connor. 7. There is no 3. Okay, let me try again. 1 and 2. How many lessons do we actually got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 groups of you? Okay. The 3 of you are going to make study notes on today's lesson. Okay? You guys are making study notes on exception handling. Right? Alex and John, the security class. Okay, authentication.
We only have like 20 students.
Yep. Connor and Josh, related data. Okay. Buddy and Peter, CRUD with Entity Framework. Mallory and Robbie, Master Pages and Validation. Justin and Hayden, Lessons 1 and 2. Okay? I'm going to make a discussion board on Blackboard under Tools and Discussion Board. And I want each of you to make some notes, basically make a cheat sheet on your topic. And everybody who's here, I'm going to compile all the notes into one PDF, and I will send it out to everybody who is in class today. You can bring it to the exam in 2 weeks. Don't share it with the people who didn't help build it. I'm also counting this as your Lab 5 mark. So what I want you to do is also just actually, you know what, submit them for Lab 5.
Everybody, like you want.
Yeah, each of you just just submit. You can submit the same thing for all 3 of you, okay? I'll compile them into one document.
Would it be possible to get like a different week, because I missed the week that we're doing, and so I haven't been ready yet, basically.
What's not working? Okay, I'll look at it in a minute, Connor. Okay, you can work with Josh, and Connor, you work with John on security. Okay?
Do you want like a point form or?
Yeah, just bullet point, just something. You don't have to write paragraphs. If I ask you questions during the exam, something you can refer to quickly and easily. What are the important points that would be most helpful to have notes on? Just point form.
The CRUD was just adding stuff up to the database, right? That kind of stuff?
Well, anything you would need to know from that week's lesson, okay, that you think I might ask questions on. I'll create a Lab 5 spot right now.
So we're writing them as if we're answering the question.
Or just anything you think would be relevant that would help you get to the answer quickly if I ask you a few multiple choice questions on that topic. I wouldn't put in the basic, most easiest things. I'd put in the things that are maybe somewhat tricky or complicated, because then you've got a quick reference to go and find that answer quickly during the exam. Okay? So I would focus on the stuff you don't understand or is hard. Don't worry about the most obvious basic things that everybody knows. So I want you to submit these by the end of class.